Hi, grade sevens, and welcome to the lesson on the War of 1812. We are going to focus this video on the causes of the war. As a history teacher, the War of 1812 is actually one of my favorite things to talk about because there's so many interesting things that come out of the war, really good stories, some very fascinating battles, and I feel like the causes of the war are quite interesting to look at because there are so many different causes that talk about so many different things. And really, it's a North American only conflict, but with causes that have reasons that stem around the globe. So let's jump into it. Last week, we looked at a virtual field trip of Fort York. And if you recall, York is another historical term which meant Toronto at the time. So we learned about the Americans invading British North America, or basically Canada, by boat and overwhelming the fort in Toronto on the shores of Lake Ontario, and the British general or commander who exploded and detonated the entire fort. And as a result, the Americans burned down Toronto. That's one battle. That's one, I don't want to say minor battle, but one small part of the entire conflict. The War of 1812 had dozens of battles and dozens of awesome stories like that. And the Fort York story was just one of them. And I use that as a way to kind of tease about what's coming further, but also to spark your interest in this conflict, because what is really interesting about the War of 1812 was it was a war that was actually fought on land where you have all probably stepped. Well, if we were in class right now, I would ask you to put up your hands and say, who here has been to Niagara Falls, into that casino area where all the restaurants and the games are, and of course walked by the falls? And a lot of you would have put your hand up. I'm guessing you're sitting at your computer thinking, yeah, that's me too. I've been there. Well, all over Niagara, battle sites of the War of 1812, including the Battle of Lundy's Lane. You've probably heard of the title of the street in Niagara. One of the main streets that goes through Niagara is called Lundy's Lane. That is the site of the bloodiest battle in North American history, the Battle of Lundy's Lane. And those are all other conflicts that happened in 1812. Other battle sites included Stony Creek, which is near Niagara, Montreal, near Ottawa, Detroit, Washington, D.C., and even all the way down at a place called New Orleans, which we've learned about in the past. But why did this war happen, and who actually won the war? So we can answer the why pretty easily. There's lots of different reasons why the war started, but the question of who won the war is still a debate that historians can't agree upon. And we'll get to that in a future lesson, but I want you to keep that in the back of your mind. That's sort of our guiding question. Who won the War of 1812? Was it the Americans who invaded Canada before it was known as Canada? Or was it the British who successfully defended the colony but lost many lives? We'll find out. Before we speak too much about the War of 1812, I need to back up a little bit and teach you something very important, because this helps you to understand the context of the war. What you need to know is that in 1775, the colonies that made up present-day United States of America, they were known as the 13 colonies. And they were getting extremely unhappy with how the British were running the country, before it was a country, by the way. So it's kind of confusing, right? Because you have to remember that America is not America until 1775 or 1774. And just like Canada is not really Canada until 1867. Canada and the United States at this time are colonies. They are colonies of the British Empire. So in 1775, when the 13 colonies or the American states decide that they no longer want to be a British colony anymore, that would be treason at the time. And treason is a crime which means to go against your king or your leader or your queen or your government or your country. And so it was war. And the Americans, they were so fed up with the way the British were running things. You've probably heard of the Boston Tea Party. It's a famous event. It's a famous protest. Basically what happened was the British brought a whole bunch of their tea in boxes and in a big boat, and they were parked in the harbor in their boat, and a bunch of American protesters overthrew the boat, not overthrew, but like took control of the boat, took all the crates of tea and dumped it in the water. It's a huge protest, and they said, "Down with the British king." And so it was a very symbolic gesture because tea at the time was very heavily taxed by the British, and obviously every good Brit loves tea, a cup of tea. And the Americans were fed up with the way that the taxes were being run. They were fed up with the way that the British were running the colonies, especially when it came to the Ohio Valley. We remember that from the 7 Years' War. They were so fed up with the Ohio Valley incident and the fact that the British actually gave that amazing, wonderful, strategic Ohio Valley land to the First Nations. They couldn't stand that. And so they started a war, the U.S. Revolutionary War, also known as the American War of Independence. And that war lasted about, almost 10 years. And it was also a very bloody conflict. And the Americans end up winning. And they become independent. And they become their very own country. And they sort of said, "Forget you, Britain, we don't need you." And they earned their independence through battle, through conflict, and through bloodshed. Canada earned its independence in a peaceful way through negotiation and discussion. And that wouldn't happen for another 100 years, but here we go. America is now independent in 1783. The war is over, and they become the United States of America officially. But wait a second, Mr. Itzo. That's like 25, 30 years before the War of 1812. What's that got to do with the War of 1812? Why did you just speak about that? Well, there's a couple reasons why I bring it up. Number one, it's a good time to remind you how much the Americans hate the British at this time. They can't stand them. We'll talk about why in a few minutes. It's also important because approximately 15% of people that were living in America at the time, they actually did not agree with this idea of a revolution. They didn't want to start a war. They didn't want to become America. They wanted to stay British. Those people were loyal. Approximately 100,000 Americans stayed loyal to the British at this time. And they decided that they could not live in a country that betrayed the British. They didn't feel safe. And so they left. And half of those people went to British North America, or BNA. And those people came to Canada. That's Canada. So you have 50,000 Americans leaving America during the War of Independence to find a safe place to live. And the British said, "Yeah, you know what? For your loyalty, we will give you land in Canada." And of course, where did they get that land? Most of it was taken from the First Nations, unfortunately. And who came? Well, the type of people that were coming, they were all types of people. Merchants, rich, poor, indentured servants, black slaves who came with the merchants who owned them, and fugitive or escaped slaves. So a whole cross section of Americans were coming into Canada, and they became known as the Loyalists, the people that were loyal to the British Crown. And they are still known to this day as United Empire Loyalists. And in fact, there are still organizations in Canada to this day where people sort of get together and they still trace their ancestry and their family history, and they are very proud of the fact that they are United Empire Loyalists, even in 2020. Yeah, they still exist in Canada. The Americans who supported independence were known as the Patriots, or because they were patriotic and they believed in this idea of their country. And that's where the name Patriots come from in the NFL. Here's a map of British North America, including, in green, you've kind of got Canada, before it was known as Canada. And with the red dots, these are the areas that were given to the Loyalists, including Acadia there in Nova Scotia. On the right, you see a poster that was used to recruit Patriot soldiers. They would have posted that in the public areas so that people would see that, there's a war coming and we need soldiers. To all brave, healthy, able-bodied, and well-disposed young men is what it says. George Washington needs you. All right, let's move on. Here's a neat little video introduction to the War of 1812 and why it's called the War of 1812.
Hi, I'm Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about what America's best at: war.
America.
Mr. Green, the United States has actually only declared war 5 times in the last 230 years. Oh, me from the past, you sniveling literalist. Well, today we're going to talk about America's first declared war, the War of 1812, so called because historians are terrible at naming things. I mean, they could have called it the Revolutionary War Part 2, or the Canadian Cataclysm, or the War to Facilitate Future Wars. But no, they just named it after the year it started.
So if you want to watch the full video about the War of 1812, this crash course video is pretty good. It's 13 minutes long, and I feel like he speaks quickly and sort of he speaks at a high school level, so I don't want to include it as a required watch, but I'm going to link it to you and you can watch it if you want. It's totally optional. The reason why I like it is because it gives you a somewhat different perspective, and the United States has a very different perspective of the war. If you ask Americans, did America win the War of 1812? And of course, they're going to say, hell yeah, we did. Wee-haw! They love bragging about the fact that they won the War of 1812. But of course, in Canada, historians believe that that's not so much the case. We'll let you guys be the judge later. Let's keep learning. Let's talk about the causes of the War of 1812. So the main overall long-term cause is something called the Napoleonic Wars. On the right here, you've got this dude named Napoleon Bonaparte. He is the commander and the general of France, and his goal is to take over the entire world. Dun, dun, dun. And of course, Britain has a problem with that. They're not going to let the French take over the entire world, and they bring the entire world into war over this, 1799 to 1815. And with Britain being extremely busy trying to fight this midget commander, by the way, he's sort of nicknamed the midget commander because he was a little short. But anyway, Americans saw this as a good opportunity because the British were so heavily occupied with the Napoleonic Wars, or the wars that Napoleon started, that this would be a good time to attack and invade. So the timing is right. What other things were they fighting about? Well, remember I mentioned the war with Napoleon? Well, the British wanted to make sure that the Americans were not trading any goods or selling any weapons or guns to the French, because if the French were being supplied by the Americans, then it would be harder to beat them. And so the British started this new, very aggressive tactic called impressment. And impressment just basically means the act of forcing individuals to serve in the military without notice or choice. So this is kind of what they were doing. The British would stop any American or French boat in the ocean, and they would say, "Stop or we'll blow you up." And at the time, the British had the best navy in the world. So if the British told you to stop, it's kind of like the police telling you to stop. You listen. And they would board their boats, and they would look at all the sailors and they'd say, "Hey, aren't you a British sailor?" And the guy would say, "No, I'm American." And he says, "Well, that means you're British." "No, no, no, I'm American." "Well, do you have any paperwork that proves that you're British?" No. "Okay, I guess you're British, but I'm not. Get on the boat." And that's how it went. And what they would do is essentially walk on boats, and they would imprison a whole bunch of American sailors and essentially take them hostage or captive and force them to serve in the British Navy. And this was happening for many years. And you'll see there the statistic between 1793 and 1812, 10,000 American sailors were forced to switch sides. And this was a really upsetting to the Americans. It was essentially kidnapping. It was essentially putting people into slavery to fight on the Navy. And the British were able to justify it by saying, "Oh yeah, well, you used to be British, and if you left the British Navy, that means you're a deserter, and that's punishable." Americans thought impressment was an offense to their national pride and their personal freedom. And needless to say, the Americans were not impressed with the idea. Get it? Impressed. They weren't impressed. All right, number 3. There's a famous incident called the USS Chesapeake Attack. Now, the Americans have this boat. It's called the USS Chesapeake. You know it's an American boat because the USS stands for the United States Service, and then the Chesapeake is the name for a boat. Every boat has a nickname or a special name. And this boat is the HMS Leopard, and you know it's a British boat because it stands for Her Majesty's Service or His Majesty's Service. His Majesty's Service Leopard, which is a British warship, it approached the USS Chesapeake off the coast of Virginia and said, "Hey, we're going to get on board, we're going to look for deserters, and we're going to impress them." But this time, the captain refused. And so the British attacked. They had 40 cannons on the boat, and they took out that boat pretty quickly. They took out their defenses. The boat didn't sink, but they killed a number of sailors, and that enraged the Americans even further. So as you can tell at this point, America and Britain, they're not getting along too well. Some other things going on. The United States started to pass laws which restricted trade involving the British and the French and the First Nations as well. The British tried to do the same with impressment and other trade embargoes. So essentially, the two countries are trying to deny each other opportunities to trade. Another reason that's going on is expansion. The British supported the creation of neutral First Nations territories. Like, remember we learned about the Ohio Valley? That really upset the Americans because the Americans wanted the Ohio Valley. They didn't want the British giving it to the First Nations. They wanted to expand. Americans believed that they needed that land to protect American settlements, and they needed to expand, get bigger. And that's what the word frontier means. A frontier is like an area where they want to expand into, like the Ohio Valley. And there is an important person that comes up, and he is a First Nations, more specifically Shawnee, chief and military leader, Tecumseh. Tecumseh stood up and he said, "No, He said no, because the Americans started sneaking into the Ohio Valley and building towns and settlements. And Tecumseh, he's sort of one of the leaders that stood up and started to organize the First Nations to fight back and say, this is our territory. We earned this after the 7 Years' War. And so he proposed an Indian Confederacy, which is a fancy word for a military alliance of different nations, where all the First Nations would live on these protected lands. And his goal was to reclaim or retake that territory for the Confederacy that had been lost to those American settlers who were encroaching into the Ohio Valley. And to make matters worse, Tecumseh's Confederacy came up with an alliance with the British. And the two of those guys worked together, the British and the First Nations, which upset the Americans even further. There's a painting of Tecumseh on the left discussing matters with, I'm not sure who. He doesn't look too happy though, does he? Last cause of the war is called the Call for War by the American war hawks, also known as this fancy term called jingoism. So Americans wanted to expand. They wanted settlements to get further and further westward, and this was a priority for many politicians throughout the 1800s in America. And many Americans viewed this takeover of North America not only as their duty, but their God-given right. They even gave it a name. They called it their manifest destiny. It is their destiny to take over North America. And so they wanted to just explode their population, build more towns, dig more gold, and just get bigger. And it was believed that it was their mission to spread American culture and this proper civilization throughout much of the continent as possible. And so the Warhawks were extremely aggressive politicians and newspaper writers who always were like writing articles about, take over the West, invade Canada, down with the British. It's basically like going back to the wild, wild West with the yeehaw, pow, pow, pow. Let's take over. That's kind of where it all began. And it's just that aggressive spirit and that aggressive mentality and very influential politicians and writers who were convincing everybody that we needed war, we need to take over, we need to expand. Let's not, sit idle. And in fact, these war hawks and even the president of the United States at the time, they thought that invading Canada would be extremely easy. And one politician is quoted as saying, "Oh yes, taking over Canada would just be a mere matter of marching." In other words, we just have to walk right in. The US president was James Madison, and many politicians under him as well were known as war hawks. They were very concerned about Britain's interference in American shipping and exports, as well as Western expansion. And they were nicknamed war hawks because of their demand for armed conflict. They demanded to take up guns and fight, and they pressured the president to take action. Here's a painting by American John Gast, which represents American ideas of expansion into the West. You can see some symbols here. We've got the train, which represents civilization. We've got shipping. We've got the new sunset, which represents a new day. We've got some American farmers who look like they know what they're doing here. We've got this fancy stagecoach, which represents, new technology and civilization. And then what are they chasing out? Well, they're chasing the buffalo away. They're chasing the First Nations people out, and they're chasing out the bears and the wildlife. In other words, it's kind of like representing a new way of life, a new way forward. And of course, obviously the most prominent figure in the painting is this angel, and the angel represents, the beauty of American futures. And also interesting, if you're interested in art, is you look at the lightness of the painting on the right here. It's like very light and bright colors. And as you move to the left of the painting, it's very dark and gloomy. You've got the storm clouds, the dark buffalo representing like evil. And this mountain range here that's actually the Appalachian Mountains. And if you remember from our previous lesson, the Appalachian Mountains was the border that started on this side, the Ohio Valley. So this is even though this is it's kind of like a painting, it's not like a photograph. It's an interesting and an important primary source because of the symbolism that you can analyze from the painting. Okay, so I'm going to pause there for now. But what I will leave you with is the thought, who won the war? Well, you can't really answer that question until next week. Stay tuned for next week's episode of the War of 1812. It'll be on the same channel at the same time. And we're going to talk about some interesting battles. And trust me, this time there are some good stories. There's a battle that uses deception and trickery. We're going to talk about a battle that was over before it even began. And a battle that happened by total accident and should have never happened at all. Whoops. We're going to learn about some important people. A handsome British general, a cunning First Nations chief, and a brave woman who ran 20 kilometers to warn the British of invasion. So, that's it for now. I'm not going to ask you to do any notes about the video or about the War of 1812, but you are going to do some further learning independently. And I've made another post in Google Classroom called the War of 1812 Research Report Assignment. So go and see that video also and check out what that's all about. Thank you, grade 7s, and have a great day.